over, Kathy.
Okay, I'm Kathy Walton. Welcome to all of you. I'm your coordinator for today for Rosetta Sit By Me, which looks like it's going to be a wonderful class. This is Linda deVelder, and she has written this book, and she has written this book and several other books. So I think it's going to be great. She has taught at many colleges, most recently University of Cincinnati. She's published several books. She taught creative writing, English, American literature, and she also taught us special classes on writing books for children, which is wonderful. I didn't even know they offered such classes. She was an editor for a while and for a book company in Elgin, Illinois, and she's just had a wonderful career. So I'm going to turn things over to her now, and if you have questions, we'll take them later. Okay, thank you.
A book is not its idea. I'm still treating this as a microphone. Okay. Okay. Is this good? All right, now we've got it. Please raise your hand if the. Okay, turn it down. Okay. We want to get this right so that it's neither too loud nor too soft. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that good? Still too loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that good? Now up a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's good. A book is not its idea. In fact, you can't copyright an idea. You can only copyright what is written down in specific words. You cannot copyright a fact. Only what is something other than a fact. If I did research for 6 days trying to find out how many Black people there were in Baltimore in 1842, and I find out after much labor, I can't copyright my work because it's just a fact. So you can only copyright the way it's said. You can only copyright the words. And so the words are what matter. That's number one. That's why we're going to listen to all the words first and hear how it is said. And of course, we all know that the way it's said matters. If I say, cut that out, I'm not serious. You're joking with me, and I just say, cut that out. If I say, cut that out, then it's a different context, isn't it? And children learn very early that the tone of something and the way it's said in total is what counts. So children, I hope, hear a book like this to them. And so I want you to experience it the way that a child might experience it. And also the illustrations are illustrations. They're secondary. A publisher almost never creates a book like this by starting with an illustrator. They start with a text written by a writer, and only when the text is complete will they be ready or able to hire an illustrator to do what they assign them to do. So Eric Velasquez, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, who is now a very accomplished illustrator of more than 30 books for children, is the illustrator that was chosen by Marshall Cavendish when this came out in 2003, 2004. And he's working only in black and white. He usually works in color today. And he was paid a flat fee for reasons that we can discuss when we get to the end. So we'll talk about the illustration separately, but I was very happy that to have him. I do like the cover very much, and I do wish the whole thing had been in color. So let's begin with a reading of this, and we can turn down the lights just a little bit and go ahead with the with reading it. A reading of Rosetta, Rosetta Sit By Me. Now where's the clicker? Read by Linda Walvoord. Written by Linda Walvoord and illustrated by Eric Velasquez. Chapter 1, the first day of school, September 1848. Miss Tracy's female seminary wasn't far from our house, but it seemed very far to me. I had to walk there by myself. I was afraid, since all the other students would be white. Papa said not to be afraid of white people, and I was trying hard. I can do this, I told myself. I can be brave. What's so hard about walking to school on a beautiful sunny morning? Even though I was already 9 years old, I had never attended a real school before. Now I had to go to school alone. Papa would have walked with me, but he was in Ohio giving a speech. Mama couldn't walk with me either. She was not feeling well this morning, and besides, I didn't want her to walk with me. People might stare at her dress and her red bandana. They might point at her and laugh. I didn't want my mama to have to see that. Anyway, Mama didn't want me to go to this school or any school. I knew the way perfectly. Only a few weeks before, in August, Papa had taken me down Alexander Street. He had held my hand as we walked to Miss Tracy's fancy seminary. After talking to the principal, Miss Tracy, he enrolled me. I had taken a test and passed it, showing I was ready. There's nothing to be afraid of, I told myself, as I strolled under the shady trees that lined the street. Painted houses with big lawns and flower beds spread out around me. I turned the corner, knowing Papa had paid the school tuition money. They knew I was coming. I hoped girls my age would be in my classes. It was a little shameful I hadn't been to a school before. That was Mama's decision when I was 6 and 7. Those were the years that Papa was away giving speeches in England. He sailed there after his first book was published. The book told right out what his old slave name was and where he lived and who his master was. Reading all of that, his former master might have found him and dragged him back into slavery. Papa's friends wanted to keep him safe. They persuaded him to flee across the ocean to England and live there for a while. Mama and my brothers and I stayed at home in America, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. During those 2 years, chapter 2, Mama and Papa. During those 2 years in Massachusetts, when Papa was away, we lived in a little house. Mama worked for a shoe factory nearby in Lynn. She kept me at home to help with my little baby brothers, Charles, Louis, and Frederick. She would bring armloads of leather and shoe forms into the house. The shoe forms were shaped like different sized feet to make larger and smaller shoes. Mama sat by the window sewing the leather. The factory man also brought a special sewing machine. As Mama used this on the shoes, I made lunch and kept the little boys busy. Mama worked for days. Then she took the finished shoes back to the factory and got her pay. She also got money from the sale of Papa's books when he was away. Sometimes Papa sent us money from his lectures in England. He also sent us letters. Friends had to come and read them to us. I wanted to learn to read and write so I could read Papa's letters too. Mama kept an account book in a drawer and saved every dollar she could. Although she could not read words, she could keep a bank account and was very thrifty. In fact, she was so thrifty that she made all the rugs and curtains in our house. While we lived in New Bedford, sometimes a Quaker lady came to our house. She helped me learn to read. So I learned a little that way. But Mama needed my help, so she kept me out of school. When Papa came back from England, he threw his arms around me and my little brothers. He had missed us terribly. He was very sorry I had not been to school. He wanted teachers to help me with reading every day. He wanted other children to become my friends, including white children. He told Mama he wanted me in a real school, and I would go to the best one. Sometimes I heard them argue quietly about it after I was supposed to be asleep. The next winter, when I was 8, Papa insisted I go away to live with Miss Abigail Mott and Miss Lydia Mott, some Quaker ladies in Albany, New York. They would help me catch up with children my age who went to school. I lived with Miss Lydia and Miss Abigail for several months. My room was quiet. Several other children, both Black and white, came to their house every day for lessons. Mama begged to have me come back home, and in the spring, Papa agreed. In April, we moved from New Bedford to Rochester, New York. Papa looked into my going to public school, but he was told I could only go to the colored school on the other side of town. I wouldn't be allowed to go to the public school in our own neighborhood, which was all white. That's why he had me take the entrance test for Miss Tracy's. In Rochester, Papa had a great black, powerful printing press. He was the most famous runaway slave in America. He was the only Negro writer to own a newspaper, the North Star, in the whole nation. It was published in Rochester and mailed all over the country. People knew our family wherever we went. But what would the white girls say to me this morning when they saw me coming to their school? Today, for my first day, I polished my shoes twice. I braided my hair 3 different ways. My mother ironed my blouse and skirt. Fine-looking carriages were bringing the white girls to school. These girls wore pinafores and beautiful hair bows. They watched me climbing toward the door. "We heard you were coming," said one girl with red hair. "Are you really going to be with us? Come play with us at recess," said another girl. I was too shy to answer. Was it possible? Was I going to be happy? I continued to climb the steps. Chapter 3. All alone. I found the principal's office inside. Miss Tracy was a plain-looking lady. "I see you made it all right, Rosetta," she said. "Just follow this teacher." The teacher led me down the hallway. Girls looked out of a classroom with big windows as we passed by. The teacher opened the door to a quiet, empty classroom. Nobody was there. She pointed to a desk and gave me several books. "You will study these," she said. Then she left me. The room smelled of chalk and wax from the floor. I sat down feeling butterflies the size of turtles in my stomach. The teacher had left before I could think of anything to say. There had been no time to ask her anything. At first, I sat very quietly. Surely someone else would come soon. Surely I would have only a little wait until they put me in a classroom with other girls. Maybe someone was talking about what class I should be in. A long time passed. Did I misunderstand? No, I was sure I was doing what the teacher said. I didn't know what on earth to do. I decided I shouldn't go back to the principal's office. I certainly could not leave or go outside. I opened the books. They were very easy reading books. Because the Motts had taught me the letters and their sounds, I could read a little, but I was still feeling the butterflies. After a long, long time, I heard the sound of feet. Girls were laughing in the halls as they got their coats. They clattered outside to the playground. It was recess time. Miss Lydia had explained that in a real school, the children go outside and play for a little while at recess. I wanted to run or jump rope or swing. My back and arms ached from sitting so long. A teacher came in. "Will I go outside and play now?" I asked. "No, Rosetta, I'm here to look at your work." She opened the book. do this page. I felt sad and ashamed. My first day at school was very, very hard. Papa hadn't said I would be all alone, but I didn't cry or argue. I just did the page. When the recess was over and the school was full again, the teacher came back. She looked at my work. She nodded. Very good. Now you may go outside. It's your turn to play. But everyone is finished. I won't have anyone to play with. Never mind that. This is your recess, said the teacher. Under a big tree, I sat on the swing. I saw girls looking at me out the window, and one of them waved. Then a teacher came to the window. She motioned to the girls to sit down. After a while, I was called inside. I found the bathroom, and I got a drink of water. I looked at my blouse. It was wrinkled a little now, and my shoes were scuffed. Papa wanted me in this school to learn from good teachers and be with other children. He was a famous orator. He had written a book and was an editor of a newspaper, but he had never been to school a single day in his life. I was practically in prison. What would I tell Mama when I got home? In my classroom, I sat down again and lay my head on the desk to think. I couldn't tell Mama. If I told Mama, she would get mad at the school and would keep me home. If I told, I'd miss school until Papa returned from Ohio. He'd want me to go back, and I would have missed a lot. My stomach was tied up in knots. I knew already what I wanted to do. I wanted to wait for Papa. He wanted me to be brave. He would help me. He would be home in about 2 weeks. Chapter 4, waiting for Papa. Those 2 weeks were the longest days of my life. I did not cry to Mama or to anyone else. I went to the school every day and sat alone in the same room. I went to recess alone and ate lunch alone. Nobody taught me. I heard the white girls chattering and laughing and doing their arithmetic. I used all the courage I had in me. I didn't run away. I didn't cry. I didn't disobey the teachers, and I didn't tell my mother what was happening. I waited for my father. I wanted to do what he expected. I told myself all of Papa's favorite stories about when he was a boy. This made the time go faster. Papa had told me these stories many times. When he was a little slave boy in Maryland, he learned to read all by himself. His white mistress had started to help him learn his letters. Then her husband stopped her and she turned mean. She took all his books away, but he had kept on learning to read all by himself. The only helpers he had were some friendly white boys he met in the streets of Baltimore. A few white workers in the shipyards where he played helped him too. He had many friends in Baltimore who were colored. They encouraged him, but they couldn't help him because they couldn't read either. Papa always knew that for colored people, there was a direct path from reading to freedom. I had books, spelling books and pretty reading books with some pictures and easy words. Papa had never had any books as a boy. He had borrowed his mistress's Bible when she wasn't home. He used to sneak his young master Tommy's writing practice books too, tracing extra circles and strokes on the empty lines. Then he would put Tommy's writing books back and no one ever noticed the extra writing. He found a few cast-off newspapers in the streets. The first real book he ever had was one that he bought himself for 50 cents. White boys told him he should get a book named The Columbian Orator. It had great speeches in it. When he was 12, he walked to a bookstore and bought it. He had earned the money to pay for it by shining shoes. But Papa in Baltimore, as a slave, had what I didn't have in this school: white friends. He had no idea that Miss Tracy didn't want white girls helping me or laughing with me or playing with me on the playground. Some people called my papa the Black Lion because he had a fiery voice and would speak out if I could just be brave until he got back. Chapter 5, Papa goes to school. At last the day came when Papa returned. He burst inside the house with his suitcase and all his papers and packages. I ran to him and threw my arms around his neck. We all got big hugs and kisses from Papa. Then he took me on his knee and looked into my eyes. I knew the first thing that he would ask me, "How did it go in school, Rosetta?" His eyes sparkled and he expected to hear happy news. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. I burst out crying. He looked amazed at this. "Why, Rosetta, darling, what on earth happened? What is it, child?" Mama came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "They keep me all alone in a room by myself. No one teaches me. I'm all alone. They won't let me play with the other girls at recess, and I even eat lunch all by myself. I am so lonely." My misery came out and fell into his big arms. "Who did this? Miss Tracy herself?" "Yes, she made me sit alone the first day." "Then we shall go together tomorrow, you and I," he said. Papa later wrote in his newspaper, quote, "I was shocked, grieved, and indignant," close quote. He felt Miss Tracy had tricked us. She had taken Papa's money for tuition and then not let me into any of the classes. Now they had me in prison in, quote, "solitary confinement," he wrote. Every girl noticed when my tall, handsome father, Frederick Douglass, came with me to school the next day. We walked hand in hand up the steps to the principal's office. The great lion, Frederick Douglass, would face the little sparrow-like Miss Tracy with her small, pinched sparrow face. Chapter 6, the children help out. Quote, "My daughter Rosetta says that she is being kept away from other pupils. Is this true?" Papa asked. "Yes, it is," was the cool reply. "If I had done otherwise, it would have injured my school and its reputation." "And how would that be?" "Some of our families would object if she were in classes with their children. We are a private school, so we are obligated to observe the wishes of the parents." "If you were going to exclude my daughter, you should have told me that in the beginning," he said. Papa's words fell like hammers. He reminded Miss Tracy he had paid tuition like the other parents. Papa sounded very firm. Not a trace of a slave's accent remained in his voice. He sounded exactly like a senator or a congressman. Miss Tracy grew a bit flustered. "There would be opposition to your daughter sitting in the white classroom," she said. "I don't believe that," said Papa. "Let us ask the students." "Very well, then, I will put the question to them. Come with me," said Miss Tracy. To my surprise, Miss Tracy led us down the hallway. She knocked briefly on a door and faced the surprised teacher and students. Papa and I stepped into the silent room. Every paper was quiet. Every face was quiet. The fall sun streamed through the big windows. Some problems were written on the board. I looked at the faces of the white girls. No one looked uneasy. In fact, some of them smiled at me. Miss Tracy rapped for attention. "Girls, Mr. Douglass is here to see if his daughter may be in this class," she said. "How many of you want Rosetta to be in your class? Raise your hands." She folded her arms. The arm of every single girl shot into the air. Miss Tracy thought the girls had misunderstood. "No, you did not understand. I said, how many of you feel that Rosetta Douglass should be allowed to come into this class as a pupil?" Again, every girl lifted her hand in the air. I do, they called. Miss Tracy grew more red-faced and flustered. One by one, she called on each of the girls. One girl said she did not mind if I stayed.
Did you mean to vote so? Are you accustomed to colored children? Miss Tracy demanded. The girl did not answer. Where would she sit then? Demanded Miss Tracy. The girl started to compete. Next to me. No, let her sit next to me. No, sit here. Let her sit here. Rosetta, sit by me. Sit by me. Other hands shot up eagerly. By me. Papa and I looked at each other and grinned. He had told me to trust white people. We would never forget that day. The children's hearts were right, my father later wrote in a letter to Mark Twain. Miss Tracy soon recovered. Well, we are not finished with this subject, she said. Chapter 7, Mr. Warner objects. That was my last day at Miss Tracy's school, but I didn't know it at the time. The children wanted me, but Miss Tracy wasn't finished. I could have been happy there, but this was 1848, so the story did not end. That evening, without telling Papa or me, Miss Tracy called a parents' meeting. Parents crowded into the meeting room. Papa and I weren't there, but our friends later told us what happened. Miss Tracy asked how many parents agreed that they wanted me to enroll. All the hands went up, all except for the hand of one person. And who objects? She asked. Mr. Horatio G. Warner stood up. He was a powerful man. He was the editor of the Rochester Courier, a newspaper with a few hundred readers. Papa's paper, the North Star, which he had started just the year before, was sent all over the nation to thousands of readers. The newspaper published by Horatio G. Warner was local. Papa spoke to big crowds everywhere in the North, and he traveled and wrote books. Mr. Warner was unknown outside of Rochester. Mr. Warner cleared his throat. I do not believe this enrollment is suitable because it betrays the boundaries that society and nature have set in place for the education of our youth, he said. Then he launched into a long speech. Mr. Warner didn't want his daughter to go to school with the daughter of Frederick Douglass. He acted like my father was a paid abolitionist, rabble-rouser, and troublemaker. He said Papa was not really from this city. He had lately come from another state to bother the good citizens of this town. He went on like that. After Mr. Warner's long speech, Miss Tracy took another vote of the parents. Again, all the parents except Mr. Warner voted to have me come to Miss Tracy's female seminary. But by Miss Tracy's rules, Mr. Warner won. If there were no objection, I would allow this enrollment, said Miss Tracy. But since there is one objection, Rosetta will not be allowed. I am a good Christian and I oppose slavery. But the issue before us is another one altogether. I am responsible for a safe, peaceful environment, and this is a threat to our peace. Chapter 8, I Leave School. While Miss Tracy's secret meeting was going on, Papa and I were at home explaining to Mama what a wonderful thing had happened. We thought I was in the school. So the next morning, I walked to school as usual with my books under my arm. This time, I could hardly wait. But when I reached the steps, Miss Tracy met me there. She must have been watching for me out the window. Rosetta, you are no longer a student here. Please return home. For a moment, I just stood there. I didn't understand. She had to tell me twice to go back home. I fled so fast that no one could see the tears of shame stinging my eyes. Somehow I made it home without dropping my books. I rushed inside, hardly able to breathe. This time I told Mama just what had happened. I knew it, she said. I knew this would come to grief. She sent a boy from the newspaper to get Papa from his office. He came rushing home, but by then I had dried my tears and was playing with Louis and Charles. Will you stay home and play with us now, Rosetta? My little brother Charles asked. Papa came into the room and gave me a hug. It's all right, Rosa. It's all right, he said. He called me Rosa sometimes at home. Will I go to the colored school now, Papa? Will I go where the school board wants me to go? No, Rosetta. You will go to the best school we can find. Mama looked sad. She hugged me. I told you, Frederick, this child does not need to leave home. She needs protection in a home. This is too much turmoil for her young heart. Rosetta, are you brave? He looked me in the eyes. This time he used my grown-up name. Yes, Papa. Do you want to have the very best teachers you could have? Yes, Papa. Well, then it is so, he said. I'll send a telegram and then we shall see. While he was gone, Mama talked to me in the kitchen. Reading is not the most important thing, she said. My life is happy, but I don't know how to read. You know your father has tried to teach me. I can't learn. I am happy without reading. But I know how to read a little already, Mama. In the future, colored children will have to learn. I know the world is changing, but I want you at home where they cannot hurt you. Mama, the white girls wanted me. They liked me. I know they did. They even voted against their teachers in order to take me into their class. I know that. I know that. I want to play with them. Wait till they see me jump rope. You are a brave girl. Chapter 9, off to Albany. So Mama's dream that I would never be hurt and Papa's dream that I would make my way in the world were in conflict. Papa sent off a telegram. That afternoon, I was so restless that finally Mama let me go down to the newspaper office to find Papa. I helped him set type. He showed me how to put the sticks of letters into the trays just straight. Then he showed me how to lock them in the pages. It was inky and dirty and exciting. I loved being around his office. Mr. Delaney was there too, talking about articles and taking notes as Papa wrote. Soon a telegraph message arrived for Papa. A messenger in a uniform came to the office to deliver it. I watched as he handed my father the paper. Papa read it slowly and a smile crossed his face. He showed it to Mr. Delaney. How shall she learn if she's not taught properly? Mr. Delaney asked. The Mott sisters are an excellent choice. Rosetta, said Papa, I have made some new arrangements. Miss Abigail answered my telegram instantly. You will go to Albany. The Motts will be happy to have you live with them again so that you can go to their school. Albany is so far from here, I said. That's right, 225 miles. I will take you on the evening train. He sent a messenger to Mama asking her to get my clothes ready. There was no time to waste. The school year had started and he didn't want me to fall behind. Later, my father would write a public letter in his newspaper. It would be addressed to Mr. Warner. It would explain that after Miss Tracy sent me home, I was welcomed into another school with white children. He pointed out that this happened within 5 hours of my being sent home from Miss Tracy's. That meant Papa had rushed to the telegraph office and heard back from Albany all in one day. He didn't mention in his letter to Mr. Warner that my new school was over 200 miles away. We had a farewell dinner. Mama brought my favorite chicken and squash and mashed potatoes to the table. I almost cried, but I was excited too. Papa made my journey sound like an adventure. He traveled on the great huffing railway locomotives all the time, and thousands of people listened to his speeches. Tonight, I would leave my pretty room with the curtains Mama had made herself, and my soft bed, and my Mama and little brothers. Papa and I would go down to the railway station, and we would board the train as it stood in the station in a cloud of white smoke. All night we would sit in the velvet seats and watch the night sky. I would leave my family and study with other children who were strangers. It was that important for me to learn to read and do arithmetic and have good teachers. All because of Mr. Horatio G. Warner. I'll wrap you some apples and cheese for the train, Mama said. She had washed and ironed all my clothes and they were perfect. She folded them into a big valise. Then she gave me gloves and a hat to wear. You be proper and polite, Rosetta, and help the sisters with the work. You're not a royal princess. They have always treated you well, Papa said. Carrying my valise, Papa helped me climb into the train. Then he climbed on after me. All aboard, the conductor shouted, waving his lantern. That night, I watched the rolling fields and hills and looked at the stars. We did not sleep. I thought about how much my life had changed in 1 year. And tonight, before I'd left, Mama had told me some special news. Next spring, she said, she would have another baby. I hoped for a baby girl this time since I already had 3 little brothers. In the morning, the 2 ladies I remembered, Miss Lydia and Miss Abigail, met us with a horse and buggy. We had a meal together. Later that day, Papa said goodbye before boarding the train for home. I will write you often, he promised, and hugged me goodbye. For the whole winter, I lived with Miss Abigail and Miss Lydia. Even though I had a little room all my own, with a pretty quilt on the bed, I was lonesome for my family, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I traveled home by train at Christmas and then returned again to Albany to continue my lessons. A Quaker home is very plain. In my room, there were no frills or ruffles, no bright colors, no dolls or pretty toys, but I did learn to love reading, and I had lots of books and other children to play with every day. The Mott sisters had a cousin in Philadelphia named James Mott. His wife, Lucretia, sometimes visited. She was a good friend of Papa's, and she was a writer and speaker for women's rights. Papa said that women should vote. We would sit and drink tea and talk about all that women would do one day in this big world, including me. I was proud that before long, when Papa sent letters, I could read them myself. I started writing letters to Papa too. I knew that I would be writing letters to him for the rest of my life. But as he was, busy as he was, he always wrote back. In March, he sent news that I had a new baby sister named Annie. I missed Mama. With a new baby, she needed my help. By spring, the Mott sisters thought I had learned enough to go home early. I thanked them for helping me and waved goodbye. I arrived home and threw my arms around Mama, Papa, my brothers, and my brand new baby sister. Papa fights back. While I had been away, Papa had not let up on Mr. Warner or the Rochester schools. Beginning in the fall, when I had left for Albany, Papa blasted Mr. Warner in the press. He used his pen like a sword, fighting with words. He wanted to get the all-white public schools of Rochester, New York, to accept colored children who lived nearby. My Papa wrote that when a person had acted unjustly, he did not have a right to privacy. Quote, the public have a right to ferret them out and bring their conduct before the country for investigation, he wrote. He wanted the American public to read about Mr. Warner's behavior. When he told my story in the North Star, readers both black and white read about me. Far away in Springfield, Illinois, even a young unknown lawyer named Abraham Lincoln was reading the North Star. My lonely 2 weeks at Miss Tracy's female seminary were known all over the land. Papa wrote this to Mr. Warner, quote, we differ in color, it is true, but who is to decide which color is more pleasing to God or more honorable among men? But I do not wish to waste words or argument on one who has shown himself full of pride and prejudice, close quote. He called Mr. Warner, quote, a despised minority of one, since Mr. Warner was the only parent who had objected to my attending Miss Tracy's. Papa did not just blast out words in one letter. He kept up the pressure. Every year after 1848, he asked the Rochester School Board for special meetings. He asked them to reconsider the question of how to educate his children. Each year they kept saying no, they would not allow his children to attend the local public school in our neighborhood. But I pay taxes on my home like every other homeowner, Papa replied. Still, they kept saying no. Papa made fiery speeches. Like a dripping faucet, he repeated his goals again and again and again. He kept writing about the news story in his paper. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are brethren, was the paper's motto. Papa not only used his pen to fight for equal schooling for colored and white children, he also used other means to fight for equality between the two races. When I was a baby in Massachusetts and he was starting to travel and give speeches, he would refuse to sit in the colored seats on trains. He always took a seat in the white section. Some conductors tried to remove him from the train, but my Papa hung on to his seat. He was so strong that it took 6 men to lift him up, seat and all, and throw him off. While he sat on a nice soft seat on the ground, the railroad had to order a new chair. The next week, he would start his protest again. After a while, the railroad company ordered the train not to stop in our town at all. The railroad people were worried that Frederick Douglass would keep getting on. He embarrassed the people who showed prejudice. He believed that shame is a powerful feeling. He always had so many stories. Sometimes my family laughed, and sometimes we cried at how hard he worked to make a way for us. Chapter 11, good news. When I moved back to Rochester, Papa hired a private tutor, Miss Phoebe Thayer, to come to the house each day. Charles, Lewis, Frederick, and I sat and worked with Miss Thayer. My baby sister Annie toddled about and watched us. Annie chewed on pencils and made marks on her own papers on the floor. Helping my little brothers and sister, I began to think I'd like to be a teacher one day. Eventually, I outgrew Miss Thayer's homeschool. Papa sent me on the train once more, this time to Ohio. In 1854, when I was 15, I attended Oberlin College. I studied to become a teacher in the young ladies preparatory department. At that time, Oberlin was one of the only colleges that would accept women. I studied there for a term, then left to become a teacher in Philadelphia. After another year or two, I moved to Salem, New Jersey, where I passed the exams to become a licensed teacher. In New Jersey, I taught school to working people. My students worked during the daytime as gardeners, maids, and cooks. At night, they came to my school to learn arithmetic, geography, and history. In Philadelphia and later in New Jersey, I boarded with close friends or relatives of my parents. In Salem, my relatives, Uncle Perry and Aunt Lizzie, were so poor that I often skipped dinner to save them the expense. I bought my own candles and soap with money my Papa sent me. One day in 1857, I went home for a visit. My father flew into the coffee shop where I was talking with friends. Rosetta, we've done it, we've won. The Rochester Public School Board is going to let Annie enter our local schools for first grade. Segregation is over in Rochester. I saw the tears in Papa's eyes. 9 years of steady protests had made a difference. Now my baby sister could walk to public school happily under the trees in our neighborhood. There would be no tuition, no angry Mr. Warner to make her go back home. All of Papa's hard work had finally paid off. Chapter 12, say hello to the future. At the time Annie started school, there was a lot of talk about how a war was coming. The North and South had been arguing bitterly about whether slavery should exist in the new states that were coming into the Union. My father continued to speak out against slavery and to ask for equal freedom for Negroes and whites. But in 1859, Papa faced a dangerous time. A white man named John Brown led an attack on a federal fort in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave rebellion. The US Army quickly took control of the fort, and John Brown was executed. There were rumors that Papa had helped John Brown. To escape danger, Papa sailed again to England. While he was there, a tragedy struck our home. Annie got sick with scarlet fever and at age 11 died. We sent a telegraph to Papa with news of her death. With a heavy heart, he sailed home on the next ship. He arrived too late for her funeral. After Annie's death, we were still proud of my little sister. Annie had been one of the first Negro children in the North to go to a public school with white children. We visited Annie's grave for the rest of our lives. In 1861, war finally broke out. Papa recruited colored soldiers to fight for the Union. My two brothers, Charles and Louis, fought. It was during this time that I met a Union soldier named Nathan Sprague. We became engaged and married in 1863. As the war continued, my father worked for equal treatment for colored and white soldiers. He met with Abraham Lincoln several times. Shortly after the war ended, Nathan and I settled in the Rochester area. For a time, we lived in my parents' home and began raising our own family. One terrible night in 1872, when we were living with Mama in the house in Rochester and Papa was away, I woke to the smell of smoke. Our house burned down that night. It was a great loss since so many memories were part of that house. Sometimes I still go to my father's office, helping with his mail and checking the proofs of his new writings. As I work on the newspaper's printing, I cross my fingers and think about my little sister, Annie. Maybe the future will fulfill my father's dream. Maybe more white children will raise their hands for freedom. I hope white and black children will go to school together and all of them will be free. Sometimes children see the truth that adults refuse to look at. The girls in Miss Tracy's female seminary were saying hello to the future as they called out that day, "Rosetta, Rosetta, sit by me."
Okay, so that is the story of Rosetta Douglass, told in her voice, and as you saw, not ending with telling about her death. She lived until 1906, and there would have been more to say. But as you can tell, one of the discussions I had with the editors and with my writing friends was beyond the point where she's going to school in Albany, so she is with the Mott sisters in an integrated school. In a way, the problem is solved in a way, and the story is maybe over. And how much more about Rosetta's life should we tell in this book? Because it is a story. And you want, after your climax, you should come to an end. You don't want to go on and on and on after the story really ended. So you can probably see that there was some thought put into how many more facts about her life do we need to put in to make it seem like a complete story and not end it in her childhood, but not bring it all the way to her death either. It's a story. It's not really a biography undertaking to tell it all. So now I wonder what your impressions and thoughts and questions are about the way the story unfolds and the way that it's told. Well, I kind of stumbled onto studying the life of Douglass sometime in the 1990s. And one of the things I used to do to get ideas for children's books was literally to thumb through an encyclopedia, if you can believe it, and just go hopping through an encyclopedia, kind of follow one idea, look up something else. And I wonder if there's a story there. I wonder if there's a story there. I wonder if there's a story there. And I got intrigued with the story of the life of Douglass. So then I began going to the closest library, which at that time was the Library of St. Mary's College in Moraga, California, where we lived at that time. It's just a few blocks from our house. The people there were very friendly toward local writers. They would let you come in and you couldn't check books out, but you could come and use the library. And it had all of the writings of Douglass. And this is just enormous. And I just fell in love with the power of Frederick Douglass to tell stories and give speeches in the story of his life. So then I'm poking around in his life for little bits, little scenarios or scenes or bits that would make a children's book. And there actually ended up 3 good ideas that I got out of his life. This is one of them, stumbling on this story about the bravery that a child had to have to say no to the easy way out, which would be to side with her mother and say, well, I don't need reading. My mother says everything's fine if I just stay home. And maybe some Quaker ladies will help me now and then, but I really don't need to learn to read. That stirred me. That's a children's book waiting to happen. The other story from Douglass that stirred me was everything Frederick Douglass says in his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He says a lot about his own childhood. I mean, you'll never find an adult famous person who wrote more about his childhood than Frederick Douglass did. He gave us so much to start with. And since he himself was good at picking out incidents in his life that stood for something, this story of how he taught himself to read stirred me to write my first. This is a picture book, and it was published in, I think, 1994. 1994, and the Rosetta book was 2004. I thought in 1994, as the world of children's books was discovering Frederick Douglass, there was a steady outpouring of children's books about Frederick Douglass that were in the picture book category. There were more than 20 of them. So this book came out, but not about his whole life, only about how he taught himself to read. And I thought how startling it would be to a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old who's being pushed to read. Like we push our kids, oh, you know your letters already, and I'm pushing and pushing. And sometimes maybe as grandparents, we worry if our own kids push their kids too much, because think of the pressure they're under to know how much their parents treasure reading. And if they can't quite keep up, what would it be like to have somebody saying, oh, I don't want you reading. Put that book down, put it away. Now it's something forbidden. And how would it be if the tables were turned? So that was the kind of thought. And this book never really made a mark. It for some reason didn't get particularly good reviews. It just didn't quite click. You never know. An author never knows which books are going to succeed. This book had 4-color illustration and was illustrated by Colin Bootman, who is another Black illustrator for children. And the publishers are always looking for a Black illustrator. And I think perhaps in order to win legitimacy for the book, in quotes, the publishers wanted everybody to know that the illustrator was Black. So this is the only book that I've ever published where a picture of me appeared with the book, because they wanted to make sure you had a picture of the illustrator. Well, at that point, Colin Boatman, I think, had just won the Coretta Scott King Award for some of his other art. So he was chosen to do this. But this book showed a lot of conflict with, I believe, one of the reasons this book did not sell well was because 2 illustrations really emphasized the ugliness of slavery. This is Frederick Douglass's master having him seized when he tries to run away. And it shows a real fight between white masters and police grabbing Douglass. And they just, I think particularly down in the South, they just didn't want to have, this isn't a nice thing to put in books for children, even though it's true. And this is a picture of Douglass teaching a Sunday school class down in the South. And his students were all young Black males between the ages of 15 and 25. They weren't the old ladies and the little children who came to Sunday school. And it was a reading school in the woods, in the quiet. And it was also indeed a Sunday school because the Bible was something they could use to learn to read. But again, I don't think the teachers were ready, and the good people, especially in the South, were ready to portray Southern slavery, this truly according to Douglass, about his own master, who himself taught Sunday school, coming and seizing Douglass and being violent about Douglass teaching Black people to read. That was just too much of a leap for me. How many of you agree that that might be a reason that somebody would turn away from this book and they would turn to a book on Douglass that was more nice and just made him look as like an excellent model slave that the whites rewarded because he did everything right? He was so outstanding. He was a model of his race, a good example. And if you step into the reality of the conflict and the real, let's say, hatred, the real teeth in prejudice that Douglass and Rosetta and they were all going to meet, it's not going to sell. So as a picture book. And so this one, I think that might be one reason, or else it's not well enough written. Maybe that's the problem. Yes. Some of the biographies for children that were coming out were telling about his childhood. Many of them were murdering his childhood, though. It was amazing to me to see what other authors did with Douglass. So I published this in 1994. In 1997, life brought me a series of circumstances where I wanted and needed to go back to teaching. And so I needed a dissertation subject at the University of Chicago. And way back when I had started, I had thought I would write on John Donne. Well, guess what? The world already has probably more dissertations than they need on John Donne, because he was the great, poet that everybody was thinking about. And I had recently studied Frederick Douglass, and I was aware of these other children's books. And I thought, I wonder if the English department at the University of Chicago would be willing to accept a dissertation that studies the image of Frederick Douglass that was created by all these other writers. Between the time when Douglass died in 1895, there started to be books for children on Douglass, going decade by decade, all the way up to 1995, as a lot of picture books were coming out. And how did they treat these things? How did they build the image of Douglass when Douglass himself gave us so much in his own writing? And there's no other source we have really for the truth about his childhood. So if a children's author is going to omit things or switch things around, or just make a big deal about a white mother figure and forget all about his Black mother or things like that, I thought it would make an interesting dissertation. Well, that worked. To make a long story short, they said yes, and I was able to find a good advisor. So that was my dissertation subject.
I was a bit intrigued by the fact that in the story, all of the children wanted to accept her. Was that your interpretation, or?
No. No, the story about what happens at Miss Tracy's school is absolutely factual, because Frederick Douglass wrote the whole story in the North Star, and you've probably all heard of the North Star. So he wrote about this story in detail, and his letter to Horatio Warner still exists, was published in the North Star. So I was solid as a rock in the primary sources that I could use to make sure this story is true. And that raises a good question, because it would be a teacher or a scholar's first question about, yeah, good story, but did it really happen? That way. And so at the back of the book, you see that the editors and I decided to have quite extensive discussion of sources. So after the end, you can see that we basically retold the whole life of Douglass, what stressed, what the primary sources were. I gave the exact citation to which letter, where to look in the North Star, how to find it, and where to look in his autobiographies for these different primary sources that I used. And then I did carefully, when David Blight's biography, fabulous biography of Douglass, came out just in the last few years. It's just first class. It's just indispensable. And so I went straight to the index and looked up Rosetta Sprague Douglass and charted down every page where she was mentioned, went back through it to see if anything that he knew. I mean, this is a scholar who spent his whole life on Douglass. He's truly read everything, and he's got, you know, an endless supply of graduate assistants who go and do his busy work for him, looking up stuff in the library, which I didn't have. So this was interesting. There's nothing in here that contradicts anything that I came up with. So I was relieved to find out that although he does not deal with this story at all, he's got so much to write about in Douglass's life. It's okay that he skipped the story. Oh, here's a.
Do you think that Douglass would be surprised by the lack of integration there is now, in especially like in public schools? I grew up in the Detroit public schools, for example, and I wouldn't say it's more integrated than it was when I grew up.
Yeah. Well, having lived in Chicago for quite a few years and knowing how things are, we certainly do still have a lot of de facto segregation going on, even though we have laws that supposedly allow students to go to school where they live. The trouble is the old redlining thing and the old fact about not integrating neighborhoods underlies the fact that sometimes we don't get the integration in schools that we should have. So would Douglass be surprised? I would say no, because since he lived through the entire Reconstruction and had to face how slow progress really was, not only in the South, but in the North. I mean, this entirely takes place in the North. This is Northern version of segregation. So just because the Northern states got rid of slavery peacefully in most cases and didn't have to go to civil war doesn't mean, just like Miss Tracy says, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm against slavery, but mixing in schools, oh, no, we could never do that. So integration of society became a completely separate, in their minds, moral issue, and social issue. I think Douglass really did tangle with the deep roots of racism in our culture. He was the first, yes, and to bring it to light more than some other Black leaders may have done, or more than, many, like in pulpits of that time, it was common for preachers to say, oh, we've forbidden slave markets for a long time, since 1790. Well, that was the foreign slave trade. The first thing that Congress was willing to do was say no to the foreign slave trade. But guess what? That was just a way of creating a monopoly on selling American slaves and, in American slave markets, and not have any competition by foreigners bringing in maybe cheap slaves from other countries or something like that. You can take a cynical view of why Congress would want to eliminate the foreign slave trade in order to let the American sale of slaves proceed in the various markets. But it's what you asked is certainly a complicated question. Other comments on this question? Would Frederick Douglass be amazed? Certainly to see how difficult it was for his adult children to make their way in the post-Civil War world in the North was very, very hard for Frederick Douglass. How many of you realize that he did marry twice? After Anna died, he married a white woman. So he faced a lot of backlash, including Rosetta. She was surprised and let down and really openly not approving of her father's marriage at age 67 to a white woman, a very respectable white woman who had worked with him and been close to him. Everything was above board and done properly about their relationship and everything, but she didn't want her father to marry a white woman. She openly said that she thought at 67, he was too old to even think of marrying again. Well, honey, he lived until 1895, so you could modify that opinion. After his first wife died, yes.
What about the sons? Did they go to school? There wasn't talk, it just talked about Rosetta and Anna going to school.
The sons, I'm a little bit shaky on recalling. Yes, he wanted all of his children, all of his children learned to read. They could write letters, so they could read and write. So yes, in the terms of their time, they were educated compared to other colored people. I guess I would put it that way. And functioned as literate people in their culture. But I'm not sure I could say what schools they went to or exactly how it worked out. They did go through the public schools of Rochester, though, because as we said, Rochester had opened up their public school system to Black children. Now, I should also mention that as we go around saying, oh, Rosetta Douglass was like 100 years before integration first hit schools in America. That's not really true, because I learned that in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the public schools were integrated. Why? So when he comes to Rochester, he's a little bit surprised that it's a very religious city. And there were 2 different Quaker congregations alive and thriving in Rochester. And I was just checking with Reverend Lyons over here, who has background in growing up in Rochester. There were at least 3 churches that were either reformed or had reformed in their title, which would be a church open to integration. It would be a private conscience decision. So he was surprised, I think, when he went to his local school. A white donor had made it possible for Frederick Douglass to own a home immediately when he came to Rochester. They wanted him to own his own home because if he owned property and paid his property taxes, he was considered a citizen of New York. And citizenship was determined by your state, at least to some extent. The states would claim that it's the state's right to determine what qualifies to vote or to be a citizen. So when Frederick Douglass gives his famous 4th of July speech in 1852, over and over he says, fellow citizens. And you might go, what do you mean you're not a citizen? Until the Dred Scott, the whole Dred Scott thing was about whether a Black can be a citizen. But guess what? In the state of New York, because I think his name was Garrett Smith, this donor had made sure that he owned property. And I guess you had to have a certain value of property. You had to be male. Of course, women couldn't vote. And you had to own property to a certain level, and you had to be a permanent resident. But he met all those requirements, so he was a citizen as far as the state of New York was concerned. Certainly, probably people challenged that. People probably challenged the validity of his marriage. He married Anna in 1839 when he had only been in New York for about 2 weeks, and she had only been in New York for about 2 days. So if you needed to be a resident in New York in order to get married, was his marriage legal? Well, don't think that we were the first people who wondered about that question. And my answer, yes, it was, because a Presbyterian or Reformed church minister had the right to determine what couples he would marry in his authority through the church. So the state of New York was willing to let the clergymen have judicial, choice because they were granting that sort of to the church. So I say yes, because he chose a Presbyterian or Reformed minister. And the Reformed ministers of that era had been performing marriages between blacks and whites, and on whatever circumstances they felt should apply, since way long before it was highly inherited that these traditions of that the clergy could determine who they would marry. And so guess what? Sometimes the church was willing to seal marriages that the public said were forbidden, not the other way around, where the church is saying, oh, no, we don't marry these people, but they can go and get a license, but we won't marry them. But this was a situation where they wouldn't be able to go and get a license just in the secular world, but in the church, they could be married. See what I mean? It was kind of upside down as far as that goes. So Douglass knew all these things, and he had been privileged to, in a way, find as much freedom as he could legitimately claim on some basis and lead the way in that way.
I have two questions. Did Rosetta go to college?
Well, yes and no. She did go to Oberlin College, and at that time, she was only 15 or 16. You could go to their preparatory department. And that was a teacher preparation program. And you didn't have to have, I think you probably had to take an entrance test. Hope College had that for a while too. It was Hope Preparatory School before it officially became Hope College. And then one level at a time, they brought it up to college level. Well, Oberlin was doing the same thing. And so scholars who write about this, they don't want to overemphasize as if she had a college degree, but we phrased it, there were licenses that you could qualify for by taking a state test to show that you had the command of geography or arithmetic or reading that you needed. And so she went to Oberlin for enough of a term that when she got to New Jersey, she could take the state test and pass it. So yes and no, she had what Oberlin had as the best they could do, but Oberlin was among the first colleges to admit women and also to admit blacks.
And did she teach school or?
Yes, she did teach. Well, I'm not sure whether she taught in public schools, but in her different teaching positions, I would say yes. Sometimes you're not sure what's a public or what's a private school, but she did teach. So she, both in Philadelphia and in Salem, New Jersey, she earned her living for a while by teaching.
So did she get married?
Yes, she married Nathan Sprague, who was a Union soldier, and they married, and I think it gave she married and she had 5 children.
Are any of them are descendants?
Oh, yes, there are Sprague descendants who come down to this day. Yes. Mhm.
Do we have any questions in the chat box?
We do have one comment from Jane in the chat. She says, sons of Frederick Douglass, I'm assuming Charles and Lewis served in infantry during Civil War, and they were well educated.
That's right. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. He recruited a great many soldiers for the Union War, and his 2 sons fought in one of the great battles where one of the Negro units really faced the heat. I forget which battle it was, but they both did serve, and honorably and very actively in battle in the Civil War. So he risked 2 of his sons in the Civil War.
Was the mother a free woman when she got married?
Yes, she was born free. That's a good question too. She was the first generation in her family where she had been born free. That's why when Douglass fled Baltimore and came to New York, putting on a disguise and taking the train and trying to secretly make it to New York as a runaway slave, she was free. So she could buy a ticket in Baltimore, and she was totally legal to journey to New York with her wedding dress with her and meet Douglass and, have their marriage. It could be one reason that he felt he absolutely had to run away when he felt he was ready to marry Anna, because she was a free woman by marrying a slave. Well, if she had married him down there, their children would have been free too, because it was done according to the condition of the mother, not the father. So if they had stayed down in Maryland, their children would have been free. In fact, when he joined a group in Baltimore called the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, it was strictly Black. Most of the other members were free, but could not read. So the Mental Improvement Society was mostly Blacks who were trying to improve themselves, trying to learn, but they couldn't read. And here's Douglass, who's 6'4", and he is a slave, but he can read. He's one of the few who can read. So that's where he met Anna. He met Anna in the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Association.
Any more questions or comments?
So Anna could read.
No, she couldn't.
I wonder.
She couldn't. She worked as a maid for wealthy families in Baltimore. I mean, she knew everything about the correct way to iron your linens and how to make the curtains and how to make the rugs and everything. She was very intelligent, but she could not read. Hard as he would try to hire tutors or to help her himself, she just couldn't get over the barriers. And so it became real, it had to be a difficult thing between them that she just couldn't enter his world in a way. And when they would have important guests who would come and talk about all the subjects he was involved in, she would go and sit by herself in the kitchen because she just felt so not included in the world he was in. And so the scholars are all very busy saying, oh, forget Anna Douglass. He married her as kind of a mistake when he was young. He didn't know what he was doing. He rushed into it. Nonsense. I say nonsense. This is an example of what the biographers don't have any right to do, that, to try and guess what really was the drive for her and for him in the way they formed the relationship and in the way that evolved during their lifetime. Certainly, she never failed him in loyalty. And certainly Douglass needed to be connected to people of the elite, of the intelligentsia, sort of forth, in order to do the work that he did. So there had to be a chasm between them. And according to Rosetta wrote a book called My Mother as I Recall Her. And so there is a book that you can turn to that Rosetta wrote about her mother that gives a lot more insight. And she's frank about troubles between herself and her mother and herself and her father at times. That book was published in 1900, only 6 years before her death. And I'm sorry, I can't put my finger on it right now, but she wrote about the relationship, that it was very difficult. Rosetta and Douglass were lonely at times. In 1869, Rosetta wrote to her father, "You say you are a lonely man. No one knows it better than myself and its causes. I have been in a measure lonely myself, but would not allow myself to analyze my feelings, as I was the daughter and had duties to fulfill in that relation," close quote. She added that as a child, her, quote, "position was anything but pleasant. You used to often say," she's writing to Douglass, "that we were all glad when you left, something that was so far from the truth as far as I was concerned. I never dared to show much zeal about anything where you were concerned, as I could never have ridicule." This implies that her mother was busy ridiculing Douglass to her children, and that it made it extremely difficult for Rosetta to live in that household because her mother was bitter about certain things. It just gives a hint. I could never have ridicule. She's writing privately to her father, And she's saying, you know, and I know that we know what we're talking about. So he's just referring to tension. She's referring to tensions at home that everybody had to deal with. So if a children's author wanted to make a more full children's book about Rosetta, you would have a hard time. You would have hard choices to make about whether to pretty up the relationship between the people as you're growing up, or whether to go ahead and reflect that. I mean, it's amazing what children's authors will and will not say about their heroic subjects. Like today, there's a book on Frederick Douglass that very freely says, in effect, that he had a romance with one of the women who was helping him, named Julia something. You know, violating his marriage, implying he was an adulterer, and saying that in a children's book. But will they show a fight that's very well documented? No, that would be a no-no. We can't say that. But something like that he was adulterous toward his wife. Oh yeah, we can put that in there because we're grown up now. That's just, come on. What are we doing? Douglass seriously mourned when Anna died. And I forget what year she died, but she did live a fairly long life. And then after a decent interval, he married this very respectable woman named Helen Pitts Douglass. And he said, my first wife was the race of my mother. My second wife was the race of my father, which is true. There's no denying that. So it just points out how hypocritical we are when we say that, oh, somebody Black married somebody white. Today, like they used to classify people from the quadroon to the octoroon. That meant a quadroon, you meant you had one Black grandparent, and the octoroon, you had one Black great grandparent. It's ridiculous what Americans do that way. And you know, like when Barack Obama goes to Africa, he doesn't feel like he fits in at all. They consider him white. And so we have our own cultural lenses on when we talk about those things. But I like his saying, my first wife was the race of my mother, and my second was the race of my father.
Is there a question from the
We
chat?
just have one more comment from Jane. She says, supposedly Anna was a member of the Underground Railroad.
Well, they both were in a sense. When they lived in Rochester, they were harboring people who had come through the pathways of the Underground Railroad. So I guess it's well documented that so it would be both of them that did. In fact, there's a copy in the little book of a note that Douglass wrote as a pass. My dear sir, there are 3 men now at my house who are in great pain and unwell. I need your advice. Please come at once. That is a coded message for somebody to come and pick up people who were on their way through Rochester. Through Rochester, you can just go straight north and at the Erie Canal. But from Rochester, it was also common to go on the train to Buffalo. And then there were routes from the train to get up into Canada. But there was a lot of activity by underground people to watch the trains and know on what specific train there might be an agent who was looking out for runaways. Then they would get a signal, and then if the train wasn't going to work out that night, he'd send them up through highways and byways straight up to Williamson, Pulteneyville, where my grandfather was a minister for a good long time. And at Pulteneyville, they're very proud of the fact that they are right on the lake. It's just right there, right off of the main street. So people can hide in houses along there with sympathetic people and slip off into a boat very easily. And a lot of lumber was going back and forth between New York and Canada. And since the logs, dark and especially at night, logs look like a person just lying there among the logs. So they would hide among the logs and get shipped to Canada with the lumber. So all kinds of wonderful stories about how it did occur, although there's a lot of mythology and fanciful stories that creep into stories of the Underground Railroad. If every person or family that had claimed to be part of the Underground Railroad had actually been so, there would have been no slaves left in the South. It's only in retrospect that a lot of people get. It's like with World War II, a lot of stories claim to be, oh, he was in the underground, you know. You have to evaluate that, what that means.
Well, you got one more question? Okay, our time.
Do you have any other books in the works?
I'm sorry.
Do you have any other books in?
Oh,
ready to go?
oh, yes, I do. Since I retired is the first time that I really have expansive time to write. And so I'm able to go back to old ideas, some of them that I'm going to put in the wastebasket, and others that I'm still intrigued with. And one of them is a story based in Pulteneyville, New York, that'll be fiction. And that brings up the question of when do you decide, how do you decide whether to go with fiction or whether to go with nonfiction? This is fiction. You know, my book is fiction because I am going into the viewpoint of Rosetta. I'm telling it as if the speaking voice is Rosetta Douglass. But as you could tell, I tried to sprinkle quotes from Douglass in here to indicate how well supported it is as to the events. And so it's a blend of guesswork. But that line is important for librarians and teachers to keep in mind that there is a significant line between fiction and nonfiction. And I think we have to be aware of those things.
Okay, I think our time is up. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed doing
yes,
it. And
Great class.